Eccoci, buongiorno a uno degli appuntamenti più attesi di questa edizione del Marine Festival, uno dei Cinema Talks che oggi è dedicato a un personaggio assolutamente straordinario, perché Brian Yuzna non è soltanto un regista, non è soltanto un produttore, non è soltanto un creatore di una serie di titoli e di sequenze straordinarie che hanno cambiato la faccia del cinema horror e del cinema di genere a partire dagli anni '80, ma per noi è anche un personaggio particolarmente amico in Italia. Molto spesso il cinema e manifestazioni importanti in Italia gli hanno reso omaggio, penso da ultimo al Festival di Trieste qualche anno fa. E però Brian Yuzna per il Marine Festival è stata una lunga caccia, devo dire. Io ero particolarmente emozionato nel vedere come trovarlo, come rincorrerlo. Lo abbiamo rincorso attraverso il Festival di Helsinki, pensate un po', perché volevamo eleggerlo come il nostro maverick dell'anno. Cosa intendiamo quando parliamo di maverick? È una storia cominciata alcuni anni fa grazie a uno straordinario critico cinematografico e animatore culturale. Si chiama Luca Svizzeretto, era un grande tifoso del nostro festival e del cinema di genere, e un uomo di un coraggio e di una simpatia contagiosa fantastica, per cui quando è, ahimè, venuto a mancare abbiamo deciso di dedicargli ogni anno un premio, il Premio Luca Svizzeretto, e abbiamo seguito quella che era la sua idea forte di cinema, e cioè quella di trovare i talenti irregolari, di trovare gli uomini di cinema che sanno inventare fuori dalle regole. E quindi il premio Svizzeretto appunto è stato dedicato da quell'anno a un maverick del cinema italiano e internazionale. Ci sono passati i fratelli Manetti, tanto per intenderci, Sergio Stivaletti, Ruggero Deodato. Quest'anno volevamo davvero che fosse un talento e un maverick assolutamente inedito, difficile da collocare, difficile da schedare, ma che ha davvero cambiato in più di un'occasione la nostra percezione del genere. E quindi eccolo qui, siamo felici che il nostro premiato dell'anno sia Brian Yuzna, che dovrebbe collegarsi fra un istante con noi, e insieme a me per dialogare con lui c'è una persona molto nota invece a chi ama il cinema in Italia, cioè il critico Roberto Silvestri, che ringrazio di essere con noi, anche perché a sua volta è un maverick della critica in qualche maniera, cioè un incursore e un terrorista di generi e di osservazioni sul cinema, perché poi parlare di cinema non è soltanto parlare dei film, è parlare di un modo di vedere la realtà, è parlare di un modo di essere nella società. Nel caso del cinema di Yuzna poi vedrete che lui potrà essere d'accordo o meno, ma insomma secondo me lui appartiene a quelle generazioni di registi che usando il genere hanno detto tantissimo anche sui nostri comportamenti sociali e politici, in fondo, di un'epoca e forse anche di oggi. Buongiorno Mr. Yuzna, good morning.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
E buongiorno
Roberto
Silvestri.
Giorgio, presentiamo un attimo, diciamo qualcosa di Brian poco prima di fargli le domande, io e te, o no?
Ma certo, ti do il podio d'onore.
Beh, ricordare che è nato nel 1949, siamo un po' coetanei, è nato a Manila e ha girato una serie di paesi prima di tornare negli Stati Uniti. Ha fatto l'università negli Stati Uniti negli anni della grande contestazione alla politica americana in Vietnam e all'aggressione del sud-est asiatico. E ha cominciato con un film molto interessante perché è una specie di body art movie. Era un film che si intitolava Self-Portrait in Brains, e in questa performance, in questo short, lui faceva un'opera d'arte distruggendo ammazzando il suo cervello, distruggendo la sua testa e facendola diventare un'opera d'arte. Questo rapporto tra il corpo e il cinema è sempre stato molto, molto intenso e ci ha regalato, credo, per dirlo in due parole, ricordiamo alcuni titoli dei film naturalmente, no? Il ciclo Re-Animator, Society, la sua opera prima dell'89, la saga Dentist, e il Faust e il Necronomicon, ma soprattutto questo girare per mantenere un'integrità da indipendente totale, e quindi essere costretto a un certo punto, quando in America non si possono più fare film, a girare e ad andare a produrre in Spagna, a produrre in Thailandia, a avere rapporti con la cultura asiatica, che è sempre stata molto presente nella sua generazione, no? La generazione dei beat guardava verso l'Asia, la generazione di Yuzna ha guardato anche verso l'Asia e verso questi mondi non occidentali, e che quindi ci facevano approdare a un altro tipo di immaginario. Un'ultima cosa che vorrei dire è che continua certo non come Roger Corman, che è un produttore che sta al 450° film, ma Brian Yuzna continua a lavorare, ha appena pubblicato un libro di cui parleremo, ci parlerà, che si intitola The Pope, sta producendo 2 film, anche di questi ce ne parlerà, cioè Bloody Bridget e I Walked with Zombies, e sta scrivendo una sceneggiatura che si intitola Shrunk, perché oltre a essere un filmmaker horror, Brian Yuzna è anche un filmmaker che soprattutto verso gli anni 90, alla fine degli anni 90-2000, ha avuto un enorme successo con la serie Tesoro, si sono ristretti i ragazzi. Il primo è dell'89, il secondo è del 97, e quindi ha avuto anche un rapporto con un tipo di immaginario sempre ai limiti, sempre al di là, che è quello dei bambini, del cinema, della commedia per bambini. Direi che, per finire, quello che un po' può essere la sua cifra, la sua qualità, è quella di avere unito una sensibilità camp, quindi una capacità di autoironia e anche di modestia e anche di umiltà molto alta, invece a interferire con una grande sensibilità gore, e cioè di andare sempre al di là del visibile consentito. Questa specie di scandalo è diciamo, quello che fa unitario il cinema horror di Brian Yuzna.
La mia prima domanda, ancora prima di Roberto Silvestri, a Brian Yuzna è quanto si riconosce in questo ritratto, perché noi europei spesso dipingiamo le persone diversamente da come si sentono quando sono in una cultura diversa, una cultura americana. Quindi mi piace sapere la sua reazione a questo portrait, a questo ritratto di Brian Yuzna.
I think it's on the whole seems pretty accurate. There are some factual things that maybe are not quite right. For example, I was born in the Philippines, but then I lived in Nicaragua and Panama and Puerto Rico before I came to the United States when I was 14. So I actually, probably the most formative period of my upbringing was in Central America, in Latin countries. But yeah, I think it's probably fairly accurate. I've certainly been mostly outside of the mainstream of filmmaking, which meant that most of my productions are small. It wasn't on purpose. I would have loved to make huge movies, but it seemed to be how things worked out for me. There is an interesting aspect to me as a filmmaker, which is that I didn't begin to make movies until I was already in my 30s. So I already had a wife and kids. And so that meant that I never took any movie classes or, studied film. And I learned how to make movies just by trying it With the first one, I just looked at books, the Self-Portrait and Brains that you mentioned. But the other ones, I just came to Hollywood, and I learned by watching the people that I hired how you did it. One more correction. After Spain, I didn't move to Thailand, I moved to Indonesia, to Jakarta.
Dunque, la mia prima domanda ovviamente è quella di tracciare una differenza tra i registi horror della tua generazione, quelli che proprio negli anni '80, durante una delle peggiori situazioni politiche, a proposito di America Latina, viveva gli Stati Uniti, no? Con le situazioni in Nicaragua, in Panama, che sono state terribili. Ecco, proprio in quegli anni c'è una generazione di registi horror indipendenti molto scatenata, di tu, Eden Lotter, Jim Muro in particolare, che fanno un cinema però con gli effetti speciali normali e non digitali. Ecco, cosa dici oggi alla nuova generazione dell'horror che ha perso un po' del carattere sovversivo del vostro cinema? Ti piacciono? Pensi che il digitale aumenti la possibilità del cinema horror o lo diminuisca?
I think that there's the what I call the rubber effects, which is the plastic, the real makeup and mechanical effects, are like puppetry. And I know effects artists who can put their hand in a sock and make it come to life. It's a performance by the effects artist to make something, to kind of perform the effect. The digital is animation. It's very, very sophisticated animation, but it's animation. And it requires many, many, many people to create that animation. So it's very difficult to do well without a lot of money, more money than independent movies can have, really. And and it's very hard to be able to perform with those effects. I only had one experience with doing digital effects. A movie I made in Indonesia was called Amphibious. It was based on the story of a giant sea scorpion. So it's a 40-foot or, say 35-meter sea scorpion. I built the whole sea scorpion in the jungle in Bali with people who had never been on a movie set and wouldn't even sit in a chair. They worked on the floor. They're Indonesians from a small village. But we built a giant sea scorpion that took 11 people to move with hydraulics. And I tried to make a puppet sea scorpion, a small one, because I knew that with a puppet, you can just keep shooting until you get something that works. Whereas with digital, when you decide to make, once you agree on the animatronic, then the next guy comes in and puts on the skin, the next guy puts the lights, they build the set all digitally, but you can't just work it. You can't, there's many layers. There's not one person who is animating it. And unless you have a tremendous amount of money, unless you're doing Jurassic Park or something like that, you don't see you can't just tell them, no, change that, because they have to throw it out. They've got to go all the way back. So there is a difference between puppetry and animation. And today, one of the things that I've noticed with genre movies today, the low budget stuff, there's a tendency for them to want to do everything digitally, to do all the effects. Even if you want some blood splattered on the wall, they'll do it digitally. Instead of, they'll just shoot the wall and then digitally later. One reason they do that is because producers and line producers are always trying to control the production. I know, I'm a producer. So you want things to happen within the budget, within the time. And so anything you can put to post-production, you would like to, because then you can get through the productions where you spend all the money and be in the post where you have time to work on it. But these digital effects for low budget movies are pretty bad. They don't convince you. Nothing's very convincing. I think now some of the younger genre directors are now starting to go back to rediscover the rubber effects and the puppetry. And I think they're realizing that there was something about them, about the 80s style, that is missing today. Can I say one more thing about that? I know that this is
Sure.
a long time. But another thing I noticed in making that big monster, Amphibious, was that, of course, the big one, the real one, the big one, it couldn't do anything. You can hardly move it. The puppet, you couldn't crawl vertically up out of the water. So I did also make the creature for some shots in digital. Those shots, when we budgeted it, we get with the budget from the digital house. This was in Brussels. You get so many shots of so much length of time. Your budget is based on how many shots and how many seconds you have. Whereas if you're shooting a puppet, you can just shoot, right? So I'm doing a shot, we need the creature to do something. We need to see the whole thing. And the shot's going to be 2.5 seconds long. And in 2.5 seconds, a real creature can't do that much. But the digital guy says, hey, I can make them do all kinds of stuff because it's no more expensive. I don't have to, it won't cost you any more to have it do more within that 2.5 seconds. And then I saw, oh, that's why the digital monsters are always jumping around so much. They don't seem real. They don't move like reality because there really isn't any weight. There's nothing slowing them down. And there's a tendency to want to just get more done within the shot. And that's something I hadn't noticed before I worked on that. There's one place that I really like digital effects. I think digital effects are really good for erasing strings or rods to manipulate the puppet. Very good for that. And I think it's good to augment. So for example, on the real sea scorpion that I made, it's got a big face, but the eyes don't seem alive. You know, there's things that you can't move things really fast with puppets. There's limits to it. So what I used the digital for was to augment it. I made the eyes and the mouth moving, did that digitally on the real photography, so it comes to life more. And I think that's really an important thing that digital effects can give you.
Vorrei domandare una cosa che mi ha sempre appassionato per tutta una generazione di registi, ma per Brian Yuzna in particolare, che ha legato la sua storia anche proprio ha detto prima, delle saghe, perché la saga di Re-Animator nasce con Stuart Gordon e poi prosegue con lui, prima come produttore e poi come regista. La saga di The Dentist è una sua idea originale. Insomma, tutto il suo cinema compattamente ruota intorno agli incubi, ai mostri, alle paure. Allora, questo è perché lui sapeva, quando ha cominciato, che era un genere che ha molto successo e che ha molto successo soprattutto sul pubblico giovane, o è perché gli piaceva tirare fuori i suoi fantasmi, il suo mondo interiore, la sua fantasia? Perché è un raro esempio di grande coerenza. Faccio quel cinema lì.
I think, like most people, I tried to make movies like the ones I loved when I grew up, when I was a kid. So I think this is pretty typical. You make movies based on movies that you've seen. I always liked horror. And in art, I always liked surrealism and expressionism. Both are kind of dreamlike art forms or painting forms. And for some reason, I just liked, I saw some horror movies when I was very young, and they really infected me, maybe. And I learned to love these movies, and I was very influenced by that. They're not the only movies that I loved. I like all cinema. And in the 60s, the best cinema was the art cinema, the art house of Fellini and, all the great art, Bergman. And I loved those movies, but I wouldn't have dared to make one. So this is where the commercial side comes in. When I began making movies, I began by producing. I raised the money. I borrowed money. And so it was not, I didn't have the luxury of failing. I had to get the money back. And I noticed that with horror movies, I'm a fan. And I know I'm a fan of horror movies because with other types of cinema, I like them all as long as it's good movie, as long as it's a good movie. But with horror, I like the bad movies. I like the ones that are kind of bad too. And that's how I know I'm a fan. And so I did think, well, if you make horror movies, not only is that what you like, but it means that if the movie isn't very good, which is probably, you need a lot of luck for the movie to be any good your first time you start making movies. If it's not very good, I'll just make sure it's real horror, and there will be some audience for that. I'm not gonna try to be respectable. I did also think, as you mentioned, that that horror is something that almost all teenagers like. During puberty, everybody likes horror because horror is all about sex, sex and death, and it's during puberty that we realize sex and death. And so I think this is it's very common for almost all kids to like horror until they hit a certain age, and then they leave it behind. Well, some of us don't, like me, but I think that came to mind too, because I thought, I looked at myself and I thought, I loved the Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe movies, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Mask of the Red Death, trilogy of the Tales of Terror. And I loved Vincent Price in those movies. And I would go see anything with Vincent Price. I went to see him in person. And I thought, you know what? If Vincent Price ever had problems, if he needed help, I would be happy to help him. Not for an autograph, not for even meeting him or anything, just because of the movies he made. And I thought, if you make movies people younger than you. When you get old, maybe they'll still be of help. So that's not a very artistic way of looking at it, but you have to understand that my approach to movies was to make a living making movies. I wanted to make movies for a living. And I did try at one point when I was young in school, I painted pictures and sold them at art show, but it just never seemed, sometimes you just wonder what value it had. But with a movie, it was very easy to know what the value is. If people want to see it, it has value. If they don't want to see it, well, it's your hobby. And I wanted people to see the movies, and I wanted to try to make them as good as they could be within the genre that they were in.
Cominciato con Stuart Gordon alla metà degli anni '80 e hai cominciato però non con Edgar Allan Poe, ma con H.P. Lovecraft, che non è esattamente uno scrittore facile da portare al cinema. Come mai questa strada commerciale attraverso Lovecraft?
When I met Stuart Gordon, I had been looking for a director to make a horror movie. And a friend of mine told me I should go see a Chicago play head of a theater. Stuart Gordon was the creative director of the Organic Theater in Chicago. So even though I was just starting in my 30s to try to make a movie, Stuart was trying to make his first movie, but he had been working as a director for 10 years already in theater. So he was very experienced. It was his idea to do a movie based on a Lovecraft story on Re-Animator. So when I met him, he already had a script for a TV pilot based on Re-Animator. And I had read Lovecraft, but as you say, he's very difficult. And usually right when the monster appears, whoever's telling the story faints. So you never get to see that part. But when I read the Re-Animator stories, I realized that they're not typical Lovecraft at all. You wouldn't call it Lovecraftian. It's more of a monkey's paw type of traditional horror story. So that made it much easier. But Stuart and Dennis Paoli, his co-writer, and William Norris, their co-writer, had already done a very good job of adapting this to a pilot. And when we developed it into a full script, we added the Dr. Hill character, we added more stuff to it. So it wasn't, it's a really good adaptation that the writers did, I think. If you read the story and watch the movie, you go, they really solved a lot of problems, especially Lovecraft almost never has a female character. He doesn't have a love story. And almost every movie has to have a love story at its base. It's very difficult to have a story that doesn't have that. So I think that you have to give credit to Stuart and his writers, his co-writers, to the fact that we started with Re-Animator. And I was very happy to, from the very beginning when he told me the idea, because I said, wow, this is a real horror movie. And that's what I want to make.
Già, e viene da domandare allora a Brian Yuzna, ma che cos'è un vero horror? Lui come lo definirebbe? Il suo horror ideale, il suo film ideale in questo genere?
Well, I think my idea of a horror movie is Re-Animator. I don't know how you get something that is any more clearly a horror movie. I mean, looking around that era, when Re-Animator came out, two other very important horror movies came out. One was Evil Dead, and one was Return of the Living Dead of Dan O'Bannon. I mean, they're horror without any apology. They have, they're fun, they're horrific, they're gory, there's sex, there's death, but each one of them is different, and yet if you think about it, they're all very similar. I like horror that has a sense of irony to it. I like, you know, one of the great things about making genre movies, horror movies, is that once you put the elements of horror that the audience expects in the movie, you can almost do anything else you want. You can do anything once you satisfy the requirements of the genre. I always think of, you know, you think if a movie is scary, you could call it a thriller, suspenseful thriller. If that thriller now has some kind of fluid, blood, goop, some kind of fluid, then it's a horror movie. And then if you add metal, something metallic, then it starts being science fiction. So that's the simple joke of how to define these genres.
Io vorrei chiedere cosa pensa dell'horror italiano, se è stato importante per la sua formazione di cinefilo vedere e scoprire Mario Bava e vedere e scoprire Dario Argento.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, certainly Mario Bava and in the 50s and 60s, and Dario Argento in the 70s and 80s, Fulci also was real horror. I mean, I think those movies were not only very successful and impressive because nobody was doing such impactful horror at that time that as the Italian cinema was doing, and continued actually even with Lamberto Bava and Stivaletti and you know, there are a lot of you know, there's a lot of influence that these movies had. Dario Argento kind of started like a kind of in the art house type of movies coming out of the 60s, and then he went from that into much more horrific stuff, but with a real sense of a surrealistic sense to it, an expressionistic sense. You know, movies like Bava's Bloody Sunday was very impactful for me and was a lot of the influence for me to create the character of Julie in Return of the Living Dead 3. In Bloody Sunday, the actress had, you know, she had put on the mask with the nails, and she had all the holes in her head, which was pretty crazy. And so with Julie, I put glass in her face, a similar type of thing. I also think that the Italian, that Bava's horror in the 50s, in the late 50s, had a great influence on Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe movies. When you look at the relationships and the style, that kind of weird world that the, you know, House of Usher and Pit and the Pendulum live in, you can really see things like Blood and Black Lace and these Bava movies, which were very elegant and had twisted kind of incestual sexual elements too. And of course, there is a theory that you know, most horror movies include some sort of incestuous taboo, because horror does deal with taboos, and that's one of the biggest ones. And I was very conscious of that when I made Society, to emphasize the incestual kind of subtext of the story with Billy and his sister in Society. So I think they've certainly been had a big effect on me.
Già, Society, 1989. Io credo che a Brian Yuzna abbiano domandato 1000 volte, 1000 cose su questo film, che è il suo primo film da regista, ma che soprattutto a noi europei, fa l'impressione di essere un film a parte anche nella sua filmografia. Un film più complesso, noi diremmo perfino un film arty. Vabbè, ci racconta la storia di Society, come gli è venuta in mente, come si è sviluppato e come è andato il film. E qui non voglio farvi perdere tempo anche nella traduzione, ma dirò che sono curioso perché io ho avuto nelle mani un primo montato di Society che è diverso da quello che poi è stato il film, come è stato distribuito. E quindi voglio capire meglio qual è stata la dinamica o anche le influenze della produzione su quel film.
Society was a script that one of the screenwriters handed to me to see if I had some interest in. I had just spent 9 months working with Dan O'Bannon on a project that he was going to direct called The Men. And it was about a woman who discovers that all men are aliens. And I loved this movie. It was horror, it was ironic, it was full of paranoia. When that project collapsed, it happened to coincide with my making a deal with a friend of mine who had started a new production company to direct my first movie. And so we just needed to find a project. And I coincidentally received this script. And when I read it, it had the same kind of paranoia that The Men did. So it was a world that I had already been living in, this idea that what we see as reality, there's something terrible underneath. And but the only thing that I was not happy with was that it didn't have any special effects, the original version of the script. And I'm a big fan of effects. And so I wanted something fantastical. In the original script, it was a blood cult. And I tried to imagine some effect that I had never seen on the screen. And I imagined the bodies melding together. And so then I worked with the writers to make that, to develop that into kind of like a new monster, a new mythology for a monster. The script, and that's where the shunting came from. The script had already had a great deal of irony in it because of the sensibilities of the writers. And I loved that. I thought the movie was very funny. The script was very funny. And as we developed the shunting, I also simultaneously tried to bring out the class mythology in the movie, the kind of, political subtext to the film, which was this class exploitation. So it was fun for me to take kind of 1960s kind of politics and make it have fun with it, make it into a new monster, a new mythology for a monster. And also I tried to bring out, as I said before, more of this sort of incest subtext, because I thought that was also it's also something that would make it kind of more disturbing. The whole movie was basically framed as a typical high school comedy from the 80s. It's in the high school, it's relationships in the high school. The only difference is that there's something dark happening underneath. And I also was I felt free to be as extreme visually as I could. So to give it a more of a surrealist feeling. Of course, you can't mention Society without mentioning Screaming Mad George, the effects artist. And I met him right at the same time as I got the script, because the movie was being financed by Japanese investors, and George is Japanese. And they asked me to meet him, saying that if I could work with him on some part of the movie, it would help them sell it in Japan. Well, it was much more than that. When I met George and saw his art, we immediately were best friends. We immediately began collaborating and jumping in and using his style for the moving, for the shunting.
Sì, infatti sono stati ben 6 i film che ha realizzato con Screaming Mad George. Io volevo chiedergli se, visto che ha anche lavorato con Walt Disney, ma con la Walt Disney Company, quindi un'altra parte della sua carriera è anche legata ai film per ragazzi, anche se particolarmente strani, particolarmente affascinanti e anche inquietanti. Cosa pensa di Walt Disney? Perché anche Walt Disney, invece dal punto di vista dell'artista, non della company, aveva una particolare attenzione a un elemento che è centrale nel suo cinema, cioè la metamorfosi, il cambiamento delle forme, qualche cosa che a lei interessa molto, credo. Cosa pensa di Disney artista?
Well, I think we can't deny what a powerful figure he was in the movies. He created the animated feature. He, had a level of animation that was phenomenal. I really liked the early movies, the Disney movies that he pioneered. Of course, he was an animator himself, so he knew animation, and I think that helped a lot when he was trying to, with his brother, to build this company. And it wasn't, they had real trouble. Their company wasn't always a success, but I think that he was able to shape those animated features in a way that's very difficult to do with animation. And I mean, for me, one of my favorites is Pinocchio, and that certainly has a lot of transformation in it. It's also very moralistic, but I find it's so dark. It's such a it's kind of like a horror movie. I love Dumbo. I think that's an incredible movie. The animation now, I think you have to jump all the way to Pixar to find something on the level of what Walt Disney did. And you see a new, you can see kind of very strong storytelling. Disney, I think, was very influenced by fairy tales, by the Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm tales with his movies. And it was incredible that he could make these movies that both adults and children could love.
L'abbiamo detto prima, filippino di nascita, formato in Sud e Centro America, uomo americano, ma che poi forse va in cerca delle sue radici, della sua formazione, andando a fare il produttore in Spagna e poi in Indonesia. Qual è il percorso per cui a un certo momento Brian Yuzna decide di diventare cittadino dell'horror del mondo e poi a un certo momento tornerà a casa e troverà un cinema forse molto diverso da quello che aveva lasciato?
Yeah, I think it definitely was different by the time I got back, and I do think that everybody who works in probably any industry finds that after 20 or 30 years, the industry changes due to technology advances, and the culture. Growing up in different countries, it affected me in the way that I never felt like I was from anywhere. I didn't really feel that I had a home anywhere. My grandparents were immigrants to Minnesota. My parents had grown up in Minnesota, which is the Midwest in the US. But when I moved to the US, I moved to the South, to Georgia, which is a very different culture. So for me, as I grew up, especially imagine there was no internet. I never knew when I moved to another country, my friends from before disappeared. I don't know anybody that I knew even in high school right now. My friends are, so on the one hand, it made me very comfortable living in different countries. Many people could not have moved to Spain, to Barcelona, and worked within the Catalan culture in a Catalan company, and been comfortable. But I kind of grew up that way, so I was fine with doing that. And the same thing goes for Indonesia, which was even more strange because it's a Muslim country. But I don't feel it's not as uncomfortable for me as it might be for many other people. So that was a benefit for me because I've many times been in meetings or in dinners or something where I didn't really speak the language. And that's very uncomfortable to a lot of people. But to me, I'm kind of used to it. And I try to just, I can get along. So it was a benefit to me because I could go to find opportunities elsewhere. And remember, when I made my first movie was Re-Animator, but my second and third movies were Dolls and From Beyond, and we shot those in Rome. And I took my family to live in Rome when I still had very small children. And of course it was great, but it wasn't difficult for me. And maybe my wife, who grew up in one place, it was more difficult for her. So I think it was, your background is what your background is. And for me, it just meant that I don't have the sense of having roots like probably most people do.
Posso ancora fare una domanda o è un po' tardi? Dunque, dobbiamo anche ricordare che Katie è una collaboratrice artistica di Brian e anche i 3 figli di Brian e di Katie Yuzna sono dei cineasti e lavorano come attori e anche come registi. È sempre più difficile per il cinema indipendente sopravvivere in questo momento, no? Soprattutto poi dopo una pandemia. Sappiamo che dopo la spagnola nel 1919 il cinema è cambiato in peggio, no? Si è sempre più monopolizzato. Però lei è ancora al lavoro e volevo sapere 2 cose. Uno sul piccolissimo film che ha fatto nel gigantesco film collettivo di 60 episodi che si intitola 60 Seconds of Solitude in Year Zero. E poi volevo sapere invece qualcosa sulla sua nuova produzione, cioè sul nuovo film che sta producendo, che si intitola Bloody Bridget, perché se non sbaglio per la prima volta è un film sui vampiri.
60 Seconds of Solitude in the Year Zero was an art project that the city of Tallinn, Estonia, made when their city was being a European cultural city for that year. And so for the end of the year, on December 22nd, they showed 60 different 1-minute films. And they had contacted me in the summer to shoot something, to make something for 1 minute. And it could be anything, but it couldn't be dialogue because they were going to have music. And I actually shot 2 things and sent them to him because I figured somebody wouldn't do one. So I ended up with 2. And so it was a very interesting projection. It was only shown 1 time, and it was right before the big gala kind of dinner and celebration with all the politicians. But we all went out to the bay, to where the ships are, the wharf, and they set up a big screen, and it was all snow, freezing cold outdoors. And they set up a big screen, and they transferred all the film to one actual celluloid film of 1 hour. And they had a projector, and they projected it while a musician with a synthesizer did music, live. And then when the film was over, they set fire to the screen and set fire to the film, and it was over. I thought it was great. That was my only art film, the only art film I've ever been involved with. Bloody Bridget is a movie that I'm helping the director, who's a good friend of mine, Richard Elfman, to make. And Richard Elfman was famous in the early 80s for the band that he created called Oingo Boingo, which was kind of a performance band that played around LA and had some successful music. And he tried to put the Oingo Boingo show as a movie, which he directed, his first movie, and it's called The Forbidden Zone. And it's just really the best cult movie you ever saw. It's great. And The Forbidden Zone, I liked it so much when I first saw it. I got it from a video store that I gave it to all my friends for Christmas. I bought all these VHS copies. And he's made some other movies since. And this Bloody Bridget is actually kind of a voodoo movie. So it's about a ordinary girl who gets confused by Baron Samedi, who's the Lord of Death in voodoo. He's down in hell, and he thinks that she's Bridget, the only white saint in voodoo. And so he thinks he's found her, and he's going to marry her, and it makes her immortal. And she ends up doing a lot of gory things, but it's a fantastic comedy, and I'm looking forward to it a lot.
Per concludere, proprio in finale, io amo proporre 3 aggettivi a Brian Yuzna per sapere quello che gli piace di più pensando a se stesso. Ironico, sognatore, disincantato. Che cos'è Brian Yuzna? È un sognatore? È un uomo ironico? O è un osservatore disincantato del mondo di oggi?
Well, I think that I would certainly not want to see myself as disenchanted. That seems like a miserable existence. A dreamer, I think I'm too practical for that. I'm also a very practical person, even though I really like creative pursuits. So I would hate to also be limited to being an ironic person. But if I had to choose of those 3, I would have to say ironic, because at least that one, it doesn't seem to limit in the way the other 2 do. I would like to say one thing about irony, though. Irony is actually, I think, a way to see the truth in two opposing ideas. So sometimes when you have two opposing ideas at the same time, the way you can express them is through irony.
Giorgio, un critico infatti aveva scritto che per definire Yuzna che è un Hieronymus Bosch con le luci al neon. Questa schizofrenia linguistica mi sembra che lo definisce molto meglio.
Well, I feel flattered by that because I love Bosch. I've got a picture by Bosch on my wall now. I love that style of painting, and I would certainly be flattered to be considered that way.
Ci sono moltissimi altri aspetti della personalità fantastica e multiforme, davvero, di Brian Yuzna che andrebbero scoperti. Io oggi ringrazio Roberto Silvestri di averci accompagnato in questo viaggio, ringrazio Brian Yuzna e lo aspettiamo al festival per il suo premio. Thank you so much, Mr. Yuzna.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm looking forward that we'll be able to sit in a restaurant without any masks on and eat some good Italian food.
It's a promise.